All right, everybody, hello and welcome to Nostalgia Trap. My name is David Parsons. Let's get into it. I was just thinking, we're living in a really unique historical moment. That moment when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris won the presidential election, but Donald Trump is still in the White House, and none of us know where this is headed, and we're arguing over the idea of a coup or a temper tantrum or whatever the fuck this might be. But we're paying attention on Nostalgia Trap, and I'm talking to the people that I trust and some of my favorite friends and historians and writers, trying to get a grip on what the fuck is happening right now and what are the possibilities. What's the lay of the land? And for that, by that I mean what's the landscape of possibilities here? So patrons of Nostalgia Trap can listen to our bonus episode with Justin Rogers Cooper, where he and I sort of gamed out some of the wilder scenarios on the table right now. So if you want to go over to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap, you can listen to that and all of our bonus content. And thanks so much for the people that have been signing up. Really, really appreciate it as we grow Nostalgia Trap into the premier podcast for figuring out what the fuck is happening. I've been talking to people on this show for 6 years now, about 230 episodes, talking to historians and writers and academics and activists and all sorts of people. And I mean, part of me thinks that if I went back and listened to all those shows, and I do dip into the archive every now and again, it's so much cringe for me because I'm sort of like, I can't believe that's what I thought, or I can't believe that's what I said, or I can't believe that's how I reacted to this particular event or idea. But I'm trying to be, in this possible post-Trumpian moment, I'm trying to be more forgiving of the steps in my own evolution. And that means my own, political evolution, however you want to call that. But the evolution of my thinking, the evolution of myself as a human being. I mean, let's not get too pretentious with it. But all I mean is that I've changed a lot, and listening to these shows, these last 6 years, it's been a turbulent historical moment for sure. But these conversations have really, for me, helped me along the path, and I feel like that evolution is still happening, and in fact, I feel like that evolution is happening in an even more rapid way right now. Maybe it's the post-election thing, but this is a really, really intense, ripe moment. So follow along, because we are doing all sorts of stuff on Nostalgia Trap. I'm going to start live streaming. I know it's crazy, but I'm entering into the live streaming world. Part of me thinks this is like my destiny as a AM radio weirdo in the middle of the night. But we're going to start live streaming. We have our first one with Danny Bessner this Thursday. I think we're going to try to keep to a regular schedule, Thursdays at 1 p.m. Pacific time. So Thursday afternoon is when you can catch me live on YouTube, on the Nostalgia Trap YouTube channel. And if you're a patron or a patron of Nostalgia Trap, a subscriber to the show, we'll be putting the live stream audio up almost immediately. So if you're part of the club here, you'll always have a chance to listen to whatever we get into on the live stream. And I don't know what it will be. I think it'll be a little different from these episodes. But either way, whatever we get into on the live stream, if you miss it and aren't able to get there on Thursday afternoons, if you're a patron of the show, you'll always be able to listen to that raw, unedited conversation at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And thanks so much for our subscribers. All right, let's get into today's show. I'm very, very happy to finally get these two fellas on the program. Today's guests are Andrew Schustek and Avi Garelick. They have a fantastic written piece, article, if you will, in the latest episode of Jewish Currents. So go to jewishcurrents.org. The latest issue is the housing issue. There are a ton of incredible scholars, incredible writers, incredible articles about so many of the sort of like dynamic elements of the housing issue, and as it relates to capitalism and everything else, in this issue that Avi and Andrew are a part of. So, the article that Avi and Andrew put together is called "The Rise and Fall of the Coops," and I will let them tell the story of the Coops because it is an incredible story. Go check out the article. Go check out this issue if you want to read all the details. But what Avi and Andrew tell us about in this episode that you're about to listen to is this moment in the history of this country and a moment in the history of New York City in which a number of Jewish working class people created a number of different ideologically based cooperative housing projects in the Bronx in New York City. And it was during the Great Depression. World War II played a role in it. This is the story of what happened when a bunch of working class Jewish communists tried to create cooperative housing. And the Coops are a very special development, a very, very special project. And that's what Avi and Andrew, I think, give as a gift to us, is a really thoughtful and compelling framework for us to understand the history of the Coops and why it's important. I'll give you the spoiler. I'll give you the little the short bit of this is that what happens when we do communal projects, cooperative projects within a framework of capitalism. What are the contradictions within that? What are the challenges within that? How can it work? How can it not work? Avi and Andrew have a lot of stuff to tell us about, and I found this to be a really, really valuable conversation. So thank you guys, and thanks for coming on and explaining what the Coops were to us. So again, I hope you enjoy this conversation, and if you want more Nostalgia Trap stuff, get in on the live stream, etc., patreon.com/Nostalgia Trap is where you do that, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. Here is me talking with Andrew Schustek and Avi Garelick. Okay, guys, thanks so much for joining me today. I'm thinking about the article that you guys wrote for Jewish Currents, the current episode of Jewish Currents, which is the housing issue. It's included with a ton of really excellent pieces that I think that Nostalgia Trap listeners would love. But I can't wait to talk to you guys about this article you wrote about the Coops, because it reminds me that a few months ago, the early 2020, right before the pandemic became the absolute sort of crushing story of the year, we had Rick Paulus, who's a journalist here in California, on, and he talked about this group Moms for Housing, which was about a group of single mothers in Oakland who were like occupying houses and fighting the cops and just intense drama around housing. And it just reminded me that this started well before the pandemic, this crisis. But you guys have written an article that goes way beyond that and sort of gives us a context for housing in the early 20th century and throughout the 20th century through this project called the Coops. So first of all, thanks for joining me. And second of all, either one of you can sort of jump in at any time here. But I just wanted to sort of start us off by asking sort of what drew you guys to writing about housing at this moment, and particularly about this specific housing project, the Coops.
Yeah, well, thank you for having us. It's a real honor to be on the Nostalgia Trap. For your audience to be aware, I'm just going to be corny for a second here. This is a show that very much influenced my thinking and drew me to graduate work and drew me to Hunter, where Avi and I met, and where I fell in love with housing and political economy. So I just wanted to thank you and Justin Rogers Cooper and Danny Bessner for creating a really amazing environment and a show. And thank you to our editors, Ari and Ariel, and all the Koopniks who really helped us out here. So I'll defer to Avi right now, but I just wanted to start it off by thanking you.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I appreciate that. And to me, like, one of the most rewarding parts of Nostalgia Trap is meeting people that are doing all sorts of interesting work connected to all the things we bring up on the show. And the show would not be what it is without the guests that come on, including some that you mentioned, but a million others. And I feel like that's the strength of the show, is the people that come on and tell us about their work. So Avi, maybe you can tell us what the Coops are for people that have no idea what we're talking about, because Andrew mentioned Koopniks as a sort of like the people associated with this place. But what are the Coops?
Sure. So thanks also for having me on the show.
For sure.
The Coops were an apartment complex built by a cooperative organization in the later part of the 1920s. And basically, it wasn't a union per se, but a cooperative association of mostly garment working, Jewish, mostly communists, basically put together their resources to finance and build a cooperative housing complex to kind of realize the ideals of living together in what they called, Andrew, help me out here,
You were under the Rochdale principles. Is that what you're referring to?
No, sorry. Just to say that they founded it as a fortress for the working class.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, yeah. They very much were intentional about their communism, and they were open communists amidst a milieu of leftist housing projects in the Bronx that were what we would describe as democratic, socialist, leftist, liberal, socialist, Zionist. There was a whole range of left categories developing housing and co-ops specifically in this area of the sort of Allerton area of the Bronx. But these were the most radical of them all. And these were the folks who had come over from Eastern Europe inspired by Marx and were witnessing 1917 in real time. And before that, the decades and over hundreds of years of struggle against czars in Russia. And so they were inspired to really create a space of not just living, but like a political movement to move into New York City and create something bigger. And so I think it's worth saying that this is the time where radicals are being shipped away. This was the time of the Red Arc, where communists were shipped back to the USSR. This was Emma Goldman being shipped away. This is the Palmer raids. And so the UWA in 1927 creates this sleepaway camp, and it sort of works. And so they ask each other, could we turn this into something bigger? And the question they asked themselves was like, how far could a communist project go under the conditions of capitalism? And that's what set in motion the development of these apartment complexes.
My question right now is sort of how radical was this group within the wider community of Jewish immigrants and Jewish people living in New York City during these early years of the 20th century? Like how outsider is the group that builds this camp that ultimately builds the Coops?
Yeah, well, yeah, Avi, why don't you?
Yeah, I mean, Andrew talked about the context a little bit, and it's important to keep in mind. Like basically within Jewish New York, I don't think they were qualitatively different. We can talk more about the range of difference, but in the broader U.S. context, where anti-immigrant laws were passed in 1925, and political radicals were under suspicion, especially if they were immigrants, the Bronx Jewish, Lower East Side Jewish left was really isolated on the level of a country. But within the Bronx, there was, like Andrew said, there was a whole milieu. The Coops has an interesting prehistory where, like Andrew said, they had a workers' summer camp. Workers would come up if they were on strike or vacation and live among fellow radical workers. And when they said, let's build housing, there were communists involved who balked. They said, basically, why should we put our resources into building this institution that is going to have to operate under capitalism? How does this help us start a revolution? And they were initially opposed, but basically came around to it because everyone else wanted to do it, and so they saw this as the chief organizing direction of the group, and took charge from there. So it was the plans were made by legit communists. The head of the Co-op Association during the period of buying the lot and planning the site actually went back to the USSR to contribute to the revolution, to Soviet Russia after before anyone moved into the Coops, and he it sort of goes south for him after that. I mean, as a Jew in the USSR.
There's a well-known history of left Jewish activism on the Lower East Side in response to the conditions that Jews and other immigrants found themselves in these tenements, which everyone has sort of an understanding of when they see New York City for the first time, or they read about early 20th century New York, these cramped, damp conditions. And this is the time of the Spanish flu. And, they are looking at these conditions, and in response to them, they are realizing that they need to take control of their space and build a housing complex for their needs, not just in terms of like the social reproduction stuff of raising a family and being able to have a space where you could live and go to work, but this is a direct response to pandemics and sickness. So it's interesting to live through this time and think about what they were going through. And I think what's great about being in this issue is that Sam Stein, Ilhan Omar, and others in this issue are gesturing towards the future of housing based on this history.
And so I'm interested also in how the people who built the Coops are building on a history themselves, right? And you talk about this in the article, and I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about that beyond this camp, which I think is amazing. And I think there are other. I think when Will Menaker was on the show, he talked about socialist camps that were sort of run as recreational, ideological, cultural projects. But I'm also wondering about, you mentioned Sunset Park, because I lived in Sunset Park for about 8 years. And can you talk a little bit about the sort of Coop or co-op principles that come from the project that began a little bit earlier in Sunset Park, Brooklyn?
Yeah. Avi, you want to take that one?
Oh, I think you did a little bit more research on the Finnish co-ops.
All right, no problem. So they are looking at this cooperative housing model from Finnish immigrants who create a development in Sunset Park called Alku, which is beginning in Finnish. And this is in turn based on a sort of these guidelines for cooperative ownership that are called the Rochdale Principles. And so in 1844, you have this British Cooperative Association named the Rochdale Society of Equitable Pioneers. And so they create these principles that are used today to form non-speculative housing co-ops, where if you are a resident, you get one share, which means you get an equal voice in the decision-making of the building. And so if you want to move in a non-cooperative apartment, you flip it, you make profit because land values constantly increase. That's one of the sort of, key laws to capital, that land values just keep going depending on certain conditions. But under cooperative living, you have to sell it back to the association at the same price you bought it. And so these Koopniks, as they would go on to call themselves, developed the Coops based on a milieu of socialist principles that predate them from other European immigrants. So there's a lot happening in New York City.
Yeah, I'm wondering, in terms of these principles, sort of how how does this happen? In other words, how does this work? It sounds like the people at the camp that were sort of saying, "Hey, how are we gonna build, how are we gonna build real estate, or how are we gonna build housing within this sort of really ugly capitalist context?" How did they seek to overcome that stuff? Because it seems like, I mean, not to spoil it, but the Coops don't survive, but they do survive for a pretty remarkable period of time. And I think that's why you're sort of recovering this history and why it's so important. But what was the idea? How are they getting out of that sort of nightmare world that the rest of us are sort of stuck in, and in terms of housing?
Here's the deal with the Bronx in the 1920s, because this was this is a phase in the process of American urbanization that I don't think we're never getting back to in the same way. A huge boom period in New York and other northeastern cities for residential construction. The elevated line had just been extended out into the Bronx, just a block away from where the Koopniks built the Coops. And so conditions were really favorable for doing this kind of building. The Koopniks were unique, or not. The Koopniks and the other Jewish co-ops that we've mentioned were unique in that they were workers pooling their savings instead of an individual capitalist engaging in speculation. But they rode the wave.
How is this related? Yeah. Maybe Andrew, you can say that. How is this related to like unionism, and because it sounds like an extension of union principles into housing?
Yeah, I just to continue off of what Avi was saying. The key thing is like, well, how does anyone build? They took out a loan. They went into debt. They pooled their resources together, but only had about 1/6 of what they needed to build this thing. And so immediately they're thrust into the main contradiction that they found themselves worried about, which is, how do we operate a capitalist, a communist sort of society within capitalist boundaries? And financial debt is sort of the key tool in which a lot of us who want to move up in the world and buy a house or go to school, all of these problems that we find ourselves in today, whether you want to go to a doctor, you got to go into debt. They took out a loan. And so this loan is really a key sort of weight around all their necks that will eventually create the conditions for them to fall apart. And so, to go on the unionism question, in contemporary history, we see guys like Abe Kazin, who is a union loyalist at this time, who's building cooperative housing alongside of the Koopniks. And so what we do in the piece is we really contrast this figure, Abe Kazin, who goes on to build tens of thousands of worker, middle-class union homes for many Jews in the city. However, another key contradiction of sort of building within capitalism is that you've got to deal with that contradiction. And so he was more flexible to this arrangement and made negotiations with folks like Robert Moses, and ended up selling out many tens of thousands of Black and brown folks who lived in apartments that they cleared out to build these union homes. So there's a real key contradiction here that I think your show has been historically looking at is what are the limits and potentials of unionism in this country. And I think we come away with not a depressing story, but a cautionary one that can warn us against how we go about building real solidarity and not just good things for union members at the expense of others.
Well, yeah.
Can I add something about the unionism?
Please do.
Just to say, I mean, this is not an area of expertise for me, but if you ever get Sam Stein on the show, we consulted with him about this, and my sense from drawing on his expertise is that this is a really, like you said, it's drawing on the principles of unionism and bringing them into housing, but it also was not a union. And much of Sam's research has been on housing built by actual unions, some of which falls under the category that Andrew was talking about, Abe Kazin, et cetera. But, in 1927, this is sort of pre-NLRA, the form of the union was not completely set, if that makes sense. So this was not a capital U union. It was this union-like formation, which was basically a voluntary cooperative association of Jewish workers who were not necessarily all part of the same industry, et cetera.
God, there's so many elements of this. In terms of like building solidarity, it seems like a ready-made element of this is the Jewish element, and there's sort of like there's a sort of Yiddish culture that's a part of the Coops that you talk about. But how much of this is in terms of that element, in terms of like creating a culture of solidarity? What maybe you could talk about like what's going on at the Coops beyond just the sort of trying to pool our material resources and buy a place so that we can live cooperatively. How is the solidarity built? Because it seems like one of the most interesting elements of your piece is sort of how working mothers are a part of this, and there's sort of a culture built into the building that seems a little bit different than what's going on in other places.
Yeah, Avi, why don't you take this one?
Yeah, this was a time. It's amazing how much has changed, but this was a time where a working class Jewish identity was, by no means a contradiction in terms. No one would have raised their eyebrows at it. Over the course of the subsequent decades, Jewishness really became cemented into the kind of semantic range of the middle class, as many Jews experienced upward mobility. But these folks were very, they weren't, there was no crisis of Jewishness associated with their communism, though they were all secular. They, like you mentioned, were Yiddish speaking. And so they were, they did a lot to develop a distinctive sort of working class culture. They had a library of mostly but not exclusively Yiddish volumes. They did a lot of education for adults and the youth. And you read the piece, you'll see they talk about the kids talk about how May Day was their high holidays. They built snowmen with Lenin's face. Like it was just through and through the understood purpose of the Coops was to share a working class culture, which was built by Jews.
Yeah, and to add on that,
go ahead.
To paint a picture of what the Coops were like, I mean, we're talking about beautiful neo-Tudor buildings that were designed by them to send a message that the workers can have nice things too. There were ivy-covered brick walls, there were gardens, stone pools with water lilies. I mean, they had it's like a Jewish Hogwarts, and the sort of the amenities that they attempted to provide to workers. We're talking butcher shops, a laundromat, tailor. I mean, could you imagine living today in New York City where this is accessible in and around your building, but not just in a way that it's a local business, but something that you contribute to, and that you're a part of, with an explicit political bent to just not just be here, but be here and move forward and bring this vision into the rest of the city and the rest of the world. And the Koopnik, the children of the Koopniks that we spoke to, described this sort of like communist Hey Arnold atmosphere, where they were getting into fights with kids who made fun of them for being communists. They got rocks thrown at them for being Jewish and communists. And, one thing I really want to address is that the Coops were a site of sometimes contradictory, but most of the time real, firm racial solidarity, forms of racial solidarity. These Koopniks were going out of their way to picket racist institutions in the Bronx. And it was a site of Black radical politics. And we discovered in our research, talking to Stephen Payne at the Bronx Historical Society, that two really, really important Black radicals, Angie Dickerson and oddly Queen Mother Moore, lived in the Coops. And for folks who are familiar with W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson, these are folks that visited Angie in the Coops. She was a freedom fighter. She was a senior member of the Civil Rights Congress. And oddly, Queen Mother Moore was a militant Black nationalist who was an active member of the Communist Party and lived in the Coops until the 1940s. And these are stories we want to share as well, that about the Coops, that there were amazing forms of racial solidarity there too.
Yeah, it seems like it's more the way you both described it there, it's more a communist working class culture than a Jewish culture. And that's part of what I wanted to ask you, and I think you answered it a little bit already, but I'm wondering sort of how are the Coops positioning themselves towards the rest of the world? Because it seems like, throughout, I'm thinking about just in my own area of historical research, which is the 1960s and 1970s, there were a lot of communal projects of people who sort of like moved out to the woods and tried to, create some sort of intentional community. It's actually, as I'm sure you guys know, it's a common feature of American history, has been that sort of idealism and that sort of attempts at creating these projects. But the Coops seem like they're very much, they're not just about sort of like going off and creating a project that's for themselves and separating themselves from society. It seems like they're sort of positioning themselves, it seems like, as part of a worldwide communist revolution, or at least outwardly thinking about politics and the way people live as part of that. But I'm wondering if both of you or one of you can speak to that. Like, sort of how are the Coops thinking about themselves as connected to the world?
Oh, this was explicitly global. We're talking about Jews and communists who would go out in the streets and collect cigarette cartons for the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, the battalion of American volunteer soldiers who went and fought Franco's army in Spain. And so they are thinking of not only defeating forms of what you would call fascism and repression at home, but they are thinking about Eastern Europe, back home. They're showing solidarity with communist movements in the developing Soviet Union. And this was a point of contention in the Coops, actually. Those who sort of stood with Stalin following the sort of news of pogroms and oppression against not just Jews, but many others. And so I just want to say, in contrast to the sort of movements that you studied, what we'd associate, I guess, with the New Left and movements that took place around that time, they saw themselves as something a little bit more radical, in my opinion, and that's why the state came down so hard on them. The FBI were constantly surveilling the premises, and when they tried to vote socialists into office in Albany, the state politicians split the district along the lines of the building to break up their vote. And
that's amazing.
This is it's absolutely absolutely stunning.
It tells you that so they're like they're connected to candidates, and they're like, they're that involved in sort of the politics outside of the building.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, though I'll say, to kind of temper this point, I mean, it's true that they had internationalist attitudes and they were involved in local politics. It's also the case, I mean, when we did interviews with kids that grew up in the Coops, and also if you watch Michal Goldman's documentary on the Coops, which is called At Home in Utopia, some of them in retrospect kind of say, living in the Coops, growing up in the Coops gave me the wrong idea of what America was like. They built this shelter or this bubble where it felt like their ideas were mainstream. There's one part in the documentary which I often think about. One of the subjects says, reminiscing on World War II, where the Coops were actually really swept up in a feeling of patriotism. He said, I had this feeling that we were bringing the whole country left, and that it would just, it would get it would just get better and better. Like America would go left. And that's like a feeling of hope, which on the precipice of McCarthyism feels, childish. And it was childish. It was a child's idea in retrospect, but which I think, they really believed, and we've been swept up in hope as well. So
yeah.
It makes me think.
No, I mean, it's a hard one to swallow. It really is. And it makes me think of that, how quickly that evolved. I mean, you mentioned World War II. I think, I think we can sort of give a little bit of context here, because the Coops they started, it's 1927, right? So the Coops begin right before the real shit of the Great Depression, and the sort of worldwide conflagration that becomes World War II are taking off. I'm wondering sort of how does that color things, because it seems like, and I'm wondering if this is correct, because what you mentioned there is, I know that in the early, during the Spanish Civil War is a very energizing moment for the young left. And I'm thinking about, radicals at City College, very close to the Coops, or I guess somewhat close to the Coops. But radicals at City College, at CUNY, they're a big part of that. And sort of like that turning into World War II, which I think sort of took the energy of the left in a different direction. But I'm wondering how that played out at the Coops. I know it's a big question, but the Coops were sort of created during a very dramatic set of historical moments.
Yeah, that's for sure. And I mean, we really should just stop to appreciate the extent to which the Coops were a how do you say, they were they protected all of these workers during the time of the Depression. I mean, it was a disaster financially, because everyone who thought that they were going to be making regular mortgage payments lost their jobs. But as we emphasize in the piece, they evicted no one. Sometimes families doubled up. Right, they were actively preventing homelessness within their community and network. And that was a time of some of the greatest activity of the early Coops, when people were facing mass unemployment poverty. And Koopniks, I forget if we talked about this in the piece, but they went out to violently repressed protests to demand unemployment payments, and that's part of why we have that today. So that obviously had a big impact, and the Coops protected people during the Depression.
Yeah. This World War II political economy that we associate with mass public spending, the New Deal, that sort of created the conditions for the financing that the Coops are able to go about. But it's worth talking about how these global and national financial currents affected how the Coops would go on to survive and not survive. And I think it's worth taking a moment to reflect on that political economy in our contemporary context, how COVID globally is creating conditions for housing in New York, and how we're all affected by the changing of interest rates, the stock market crash. We're all tied into this global economy. So it's worth considering that as the stock market crash created in 1929 created these opportunities, and World War II economy kept them afloat. By 1943, that moratorium on evictions that was passed during the Great Depression, that went away. And so the Coops had to negotiate these new terms with their mortgage lender. And remember, they're in debt. And so the two sides come to this agreement that they need to raise the rent by $1 per room, which is not insignificant, but they need to bring this up to a vote. And so that vote becomes this real site of contention for Koopniks. Maybe we could get into that, but it's worth also discussing that this was an area that was yellow lined. We're familiar with the term redlining, which was another form that the state takes in making sure that certain neighborhoods were disadvantaged due to populations of color, mostly Black, and they yellow lined it due to the communistic area of the reputation of the area, which I think is just worth mentioning. So lenders were encouraged to be very conservative in their lending in the area. So we're still living in sort of a political economy created by these decisions by the state.
Is this moment sort of like the beginning of the end of the Coops in some way, as they sort of start to as the eviction thing ends and the moratorium ends on the evictions, and they're sort of renegotiating mortgages? It seems like, I mean, part of your story is the Coops sort of tragically drawn into that financial and real estate system that they tried to avoid for so long. Is that what's happening at the end of World War II?
Yeah, absolutely. Avi, I think you want to go into this very dramatic moment of the vote.
Yeah, I can talk about the vote. So I just want to, say, I've been thinking about this recently. Like, the Coops are still there. The buildings are still there. The members of the Coops United Workers Association put all their savings into the financing of this building when times were good. The boom and bust cycle of capitalism, it's like Lucy with the football on this one. They ran at the football thinking that this would pay off for them. They lost all of their investment when the Coops were privatized following the vote, which I can talk about. And the buildings themselves continue to be a resource for the capitalist city and housing the underemployed and the working class people of color of this city, housing them poorly. So it's like, it really feels like theft to me the more that I think about it. You know what I mean?
And theft by what forces? I mean, obviously the forces of capital, right? But it seems like it takes place over a period of time.
Yeah. So what happened with this vote is they had the opportunity to refinance the mortgage, and like Andrew said, they were facing a dollar increase per room per month, and they brought it to a vote, and there was a ton of opposition. The opposition was basically a matter of principle. They, like we discussed earlier, they came up from a milieu of Jewish radicalism, which kind of pioneered the rent strike back on the Lower East Side. So they were really used to, they had a culture of opposing rent raises. And they were also concerned, I'm not sure how serious this threat really was, but they were concerned that the private landlords of the Bronx would use them as an example after they raised rents. And they said, look, even the communists are raising the rent. We have to do it to you too. So they resisted that. And there was a vote, which as far as I understand, it was a close vote, but the refinancing was rejected, and they ended up going private, basically meaning that the private landlord, which had already taken control, also took control of the management of the building.
I'm wondering about that vote. I think people will want to know sort of what is the sort of governing structure of the Coops. In other words, like, there are so many different ways that we've seen these sorts of projects struggle with that. Trying to have a cooperatively run, democratically operated housing situation seems really tricky. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how did they approach that? How did people vote? Who ran these things?
Yeah, there was a board at the Coops, and this itself, like leadership in leftist movements, historically is a site of contradictions as well, on race, class, gender, and our research led us to different conclusions about how much solidarity they showed with women. There were women who said that they felt very welcomed in leadership, whether it came to having the support of the men who were there. And there were some who said that it felt like a boys' club, which I think for anyone who's been in a leftist or any space for that matter, it could really be dominated by men. It's also a site of contradictions in terms of race. There's this sort of undercurrent of racial solidarity in the Coops, but there's also the Communist Party of New York punishing members, some of whom lived in the Coops, for not showing enough solidarity with the struggles of Black and brown residents in New York City. But our research led us to this sort of dramatic scene in this auditorium in which they watched Soviet film. And within this sort of space where they were used to sort of partaking in culture and the kids would go and play, they had this vote where it sounded like there was a few folks up front who asked everyone what they wanted. And Avi, please correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounded like this was sort of like a raise your hand, make some noise if you feel a certain way. And one of the children of the Koopniks that we interviewed, a guy named Pete Rosenblum, who features heavily in At Home in Utopia, and who we both were able to spend hours on the phone with, who is his own sort of red Forrest Gump character. And we could get into the life of Pete Rosenblum, whose wife did battle with Donald Trump in the 90s, and whose friend Jimmy started in These Times magazine. He described this scene where it was so contentious that when his friend got up to make an argument to passionately, increase the rent so that we don't lose the Coops and we could keep our structure, he got up and made this impassioned plea, and everyone started booing him. So he turned around like he was mooning them all and stuck his behind out at them. But it was a pretty contentious thing, and it sounded like leadership went the direction of not raising the rent, which is ultimately what created the conditions for the Coops to go private.
Yeah, this is a lesson that anyone who's taken leadership in a democratic, truly and genuinely democratic organization can take to heart, which is, if there's an outcome that is better, you have to whip votes. You have to talk to people in advance and make sure they understand the situation and make sure you have the majority secured before you walk into that mass meeting.
Wow. I'm wondering in terms of people leaving the Coops after World War II. Do people move out? And where do they go? And is that in other words, do the Coops sort of experience this period where people are moving on to what they perceive as better housing somewhere in the years after World War II?
Yeah, so the spirit of the Coops remains for, it sounds like, a while after this vote. They continue radical activities, the Black solidarity that Andrew talked about, et cetera. But basically the structural forces of suburbanization and white flight, which listeners are probably familiar with on a basic level, affected the Coops as well. So we talked to families who moved out to Long Island, California, and especially an interesting note, Co-op City, which was a co-op built by Abe Kazin in the 60s, which had the modern amenities of an elevator building, I think AC, which the somewhat older first generation of the Coops was attracted to. They were attracted to the modern amenities and the co-op structure. So there you can see, they were attracted to better housing, but they also wanted to return to the co-op life.
And it seems like the communism is going away too. I mean, and World War II, certainly is going to be part of that. But I mean, we're entering into the Cold War, in which communism is going to be attacked and nearly eradicated as a legitimate political expression in America, and it seems like that would be part of it as well. I mean, that might be an obvious point, but it seems like the golden age of radical communists having a sort of place within the landscape of the American economy and politics seems like it's waning at that moment, and it makes sense that the Coops would a lot of people would be moving on.
Yeah, as Pete told us, those Lenin busts that everyone displayed in their home were going in the garbage. And I think it's worth noting again that, and why Avi and I are drawn to issues of housing and spatial arrangements of capital and the way that we choose to interface with it, but mostly the way that it organizes us and organizes us in categories of class and race and gender and sex. And so it's taking the form of the suburbs, and much has been written about the ways that the suburbs both intentionally were developed to break up these bonds of solidarity and break up radical politics by physically separating people and giving them space. But I also think it's interesting, and this is an interesting contradiction here, the ways that these radical communists had their own desires of space and nice amenities, and the ways that social, political currents of war and political economy temper and shape and mold their own politics. And these are people who remained leftist for their whole lives. Especially some of the Koopniks we spoke to who moved to Long Island. One of them who built a nursery co-op that exists today still in Plainview. But your work and your research along how radical movements operated during the Vietnam War in those coffee shops offer some sort of I think what we're witnessing here is some sort of anticipation where these things get broken up over time, especially as people move away from each other.
Well, yeah, and the coming of suburbia and a more accessible middle class lifestyle, particularly for people who could pass as white in the years after World War II, seems like it's gonna be a big force. I mean, that's a contradiction that we just did this episode yesterday about Guy Fieri when we're talking about desire desire and food. And it's such a contradiction within capitalism. It's very hard to. I mean, it seems impossible even. And this story of people leaving and going out to, I'm still a communist. I'm still a leftist, but I want a suburban home in Long Island and a backyard and air conditioning and a garage. There's this sort of really tricky thing to reconcile between the principles we want to live. The world we want, and our sort of personal, and we always I don't know, we always sort of cast this in terms of individual hypocrisy and things like that. I wonder if there's a different way to talk about it, because it seems like if even the communists want the suburban home, then we need to have a conversation about that, right?
Oh, this is really, yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't emphasize that too much. Look, we talked to, was it Sonia who started the nursery school?
Yes.
Yeah. Why did they move to Plainview? They moved to Plainview because that's where the job was for her husband, who was a lawyer or a doctor or something. I don't know.
The market makes,
The market makes decisions for you. What can I say?
Yeah. I think that makes sense.
I don't know who wanted a garage and who didn't.
Right. No, that's a really important point. Because I don't want to cast it as just this happened because people are craven and want this shit. I mean, we exist within a set of a framework of economic possibilities that really limit our choices. And I think that's part of it as well.
And I want to say that the suburban lifestyle was a disaster for feminism, especially compared to the Coops, where they had communal kitchens and cooperatively organized childcare. Yeah,
I mean, I think that's what I wanted to get at, is sort of what's lost and what's gained when the Coops go away. And it seems like there's a lot to talk about there.
Yeah. And they were reduced to renters in their own building, which I'm emphasizing. They put their savings into this building, and then they were reduced to renters, which could have been a disaster for all of them if they were not swept up in the arc of upward mobility that was offered to Jewish Americans in the subsequent decades. They were able to turn around and make a down payment on a house. And to live a comfortable middle-class professional lifestyle, even though their parents' savings had been thrown in the trash.
Ugh. I mean, doesn't that seem like something that's repeated in the subprime mortgage crisis? People's houses literally stolen by banks in 2008, and yet people still lining up to put their savings down for a house. It seems like that cycle continues in our time.
It's the boom and bust cycle of building. Yeah.
And it's very much intentional, as many would say, feature, not bug, of what Samuel Stein, who Avi mentioned before, who's been a real mentor and a guiding figure for us in terms of the way that we think of his framework of the real estate state, this sort of power structure that prioritizes financial capital of real estate and its influence over our lives, and creates and reproduces these issues of gentrification and homelessness, all of these really cyclical and quite frankly predictable features of capitalism. Sam really did an amazing job in his book, Capital City,
Mm.
to guide us here and shape our thinking about the ways that real estate, like Avi said before, the market makes decisions for you. The way that real estate has this inordinate power in our lives, whether we recognize it or not. And to us, I think the Coops offer this really interesting piece of history that can offer lessons today about how we go about fighting capital and how we go about organizing. And I just want to shout out Sia Weaver, who's doing an amazing job here in the New York housing movement.
I'm wondering if we can say a little bit about what's going on there, and maybe a tiny bit of if you encountered any other projects around the same time within the Bronx. Because this milieu seems like it's not just the Coops. There might have been other projects going on, but in terms of legacy, I mean, what's our takeaway here? What's our lesson? Do we tell workers now to pool their money and buy a property within the framework that we're in right now, or where is the energy in terms of housing activism now? Because I mentioned Rick Paulus, and out here in Oakland, we've got Moms for Housing that were occupying houses that were empty in Oakland, and that turning into a bigger sort of movement around collective housing and things like that. But I'm wondering if you guys encountering what's happening right now around housing, and if it's related to anything. I mean, anything in the Coops in terms of that historical legacy.
We're in a renaissance of the tenants movement, especially in New York, but also across the country. You mentioned the occupation in Oakland. That kind of organized energy stems from the value, or even the sense of a right, that it's the people that need the housing that fundamentally own it, and that they're you're exercising your right, you're claiming what you own, when in a housing crisis you take over the housing. So it fills my heart to see news items like Moms for Housing, because it's a fundamental reorientation of the dominant property paradigm. In New York now, we have this beautiful thing with rent stabilization, which was recently revitalized, which is that tenants are closer to being owners than they are almost anywhere else in the country, because you've got your right to a lease renewal, and so forth. There are really legacy rent stabilized tenants, in a way that is really special. But the idea of tenant or resident ownership and control has the potential to break out even further, since I know the one of the current demands of the Housing Justice for All New York Tenant Coalition is the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, and that's actually the goal there is to orient state purchasing power towards the private housing market to compete with buyers, with private buyers, and to help tenants take ownership and control of their buildings.
Yeah, and this is all, and this is a point that some may take for granted, but these rights and the sort of forms that rent control takes, whatever forms they are in this country right now, they do not just happen. You need an organized and militant movement, and it's worth considering and historicizing our contemporary movement with what came before and what might come later. And I think what I find so interesting about the nostalgia trap is oftentimes we're in this nostalgia trap of in the left sometimes can get mired in ideas of that golden age of capitalism and strong unions. But we saw what happened following that neoliberal turn, in which there was deindustrialization and the union movement was sort of systematically destroyed. And those conditions gave rise to that real estate state. And so this is all a long-winded way to say that we should take stock of that past and sort of theorize where we might go. And I feel pretty confident with the housing movement in New York that's being built right now. It's a real amazing thing to see. So much organizing and so much activity happening at the level of where we live. This area of like the primacy of social reproduction, right? Like this is why Jewish Currents did the housing issues, because it's so important. And so again, it's worth mentioning that the Coops today are, they're owned by this company called Garelick Management, and they've got 900 open violations on these two buildings. Hundreds of rent stabilized units were deregulated, a ton of evictions, and this is one of the worst zip codes in the state for COVID. And so it's worth thinking about how we went from this area that the Koopniks built as a fortress for the working class in response to pandemics to this place where mostly people of color, working class, are cramped into unsafe housing and high rents. And so how do we get there?
Well, I mean, it's such a tragic and instructive story, and thanks for sharing it not only with us today, but in Jewish Currents, which I encourage everyone listening to go check out this housing issue, because what you touched on there, and both of you touched on throughout this whole conversation is this sort of evolution that's happened where I don't know, like forgive the gendered metaphor, but it seems like the radicalism was neutered in the 20th century in part by this, middle class expansion of the middle class, urbanization, and the radicalization being also attacked by the federal government and other forces. But the result of that, is that there was this period where the radicalization went away, and I'm wondering if we're entering a period now where that buffer. That the availability of a lifestyle that was that's in some way served as a sort of force of neutering the radicalism is no longer there, no longer working for many Americans, and pushing us to the point where we do get to the point where there's enough militancy and enough people willing to act in solidarity to change these conditions. That's my optimistic take on things, but it does seem like the crisis that we're in terms of pandemic has accelerated a crisis that was already there with housing. But again, thank you guys so much for sharing your story. I think it's an important one, and I'll point everyone to go read it and to consider it, because it's one that will, I think, help people frame what's going on now.
Well, it's a real pleasure, and we did not get here without the guidance of folks like Professor Matt Lasner, who has been an amazing mentor for the both of us at Hunter College. And so I just want to say thank you to him specifically, and of course Sam Stein and our editors one more time, and the Koopniks who helped us out. So thank you.
Thank you, Koopniks. Thank you, Avi.
Sure thing.
Okay, that is going to do it for Nostalgia Trap today. Thanks so much to Avi Garelick and Andrew Schustek. Really great to talk to those guys. I hope you enjoyed our conversation, and go check out that whole housing issue of Jewish Currents. You can do that at jewishcurrents.org. Really, really thoughtful and compelling stuff. and I really think housing is the battleground of the future, and I think that we'll be talking more about it on Nostalgia Trap as things move forward. Like I said, we've got some cool stuff on the Patreon for subscribers. Go over to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Just put up an episode with Justin Rogers Cooper talking about all the scenarios that might come out of this election moment. But also, we're going to be live streaming today, Thursdays, 1 p.m. Danny Bessner will be with me this Thursday, so come check that out. I think we'll probably be gaming out scenarios as well. And if you miss that, you can check out the live stream always if you're a subscriber. So patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. All right, talk to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.